It's the week ending Saturday, the 2nd of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen bombs flying over Japan, we've marked the 20th anniversary of the death of Princess Diana, and we've heard from Theresa May for the first time in a while, saying she's in it for the long haul. Well, so are we. As always, we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Felicity, Capon, Jamie Timson and Holden, Frith. And starting the show with his top pick of the week, it's Jamie. What have you got for us?
Is this the week Tories look to gain momentum?
What a great character. He's not afraid to be himself, and I find that really refreshing. He's not a politician who's going to lie down and be what everyone wants him to be. He's quite happy to be himself and stand up for what he believes in, even if that is wearing a double-breasted suit. Taken from Politics UK, a centre-right student media organisation, that was the voice of Anne, aged 27, from Edinburgh, who is passionate about Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jamie, is this the future of British politics?
I think we can all certainly hope so, can't we? This week will be remembered for the launch of the grassroots campaign Activate. They've already said that they're looking to take on the idea of Momentum, the left-wing group started after Jeremy Corbyn became Labour leader, in order to galvanise the thousands upon thousands of young Tory voters out there who are just looking for a way to take on Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't noticed, listeners, Jamie is employing a slightly sneery tone here. But actually, it's legitimate, isn't it, as the country's biggest political party, that they look at the success that Labour had at the last election. OK, they lost, but they didn't lose as badly as everyone thought because of their harnessing the young vote, and say, we need to get in on this.
Certainly this week, you wouldn't be able to find a Tory MP that would put their name next to Activate, but they've all, particularly the more liberal Tory MPs like Damien Green, have spoken about this idea of needing to change the Tory image, and particularly if you look at a recent YouGov poll that came out that said among 18 to 24-year-olds, 66% would vote for Labour, whereas only 14% would vote for the Tories. And then also across most policy, actually all policy areas, Labour had a lead. Obviously in the kind of the more commonly Labour areas such as the NHS and education, it was bigger than, but even in the economy, that was still the case. So, I mean, I think certainly the Tories have realised they have to do something about the big gap amongst young people. I think the problem is that Activate particularly went about it the wrong way. They started off this week with a meme taken from Star Wars, that famous young person's favourite film, in which Jeremy Corbyn was placed next to an image of Admiral Akbar with the sign, "It's a trap," underneath.
Well, Felicity, you work for the Week Junior.
Yes.
OK, you're targeting younger people than these young people.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, Activate are targeting your readers in 5 or 6 years' time, aren't they?
Yeah.
Is memes the way to do that?
Quite possibly, but I don't think their memes and their hashtags hit the right note. I don't think they had proven that they'd mastered social media in the way that they'll need to. But I think it's probably more about memes and hashtags anyway. It's about policies and what the Conservatives are actually saying they can offer young people. And I don't think that's what they've maybe nailed. I think they can perhaps get away with a really fantastic social media campaign, which they don't actually have anyway. But even if they did have one, I think they're going to need policies. And I think they're also going to need some new insurgent leader who's going to come and revitalise the party, and I don't think they have that either.
Yeah, well, that's the point, isn't it, Holden? You know, it's all very well saying that this is the Tories' equivalent of Momentum, but it isn't, because the point of Momentum was Jeremy Corbyn felt like an outsider and people wanted to say, yes, we as young people are behind him. This is clearly top-down from within the Conservative Party. It isn't a grassroots movement.
No, and Momentum, for all of its faults, and there are many, this just feels paper thin. It feels like there's about 15 minutes of thought gone into it, and it was so thin that it had started to unravel within 24 hours, where there was a story about a WhatsApp group where people had started to talk about gassing the chavs within this chat room, and then others were trying to say we need to be careful this doesn't become Nazi chat. But even so, that still didn't stop that conversation developing. And you had this kind of sense of a few grown-ups in the room desperately trying to keep control of a few other misfits.
But actually, you do see that in Momentum as well.
Oh, Momentum's got huge problems
I'm
with
sure there's some pretty
abuse.
serious anti-Tory chat in the Momentum boards.
Yeah, there's a huge problem of abuse within Momentum, but it's a much, much bigger group, and it also has momentum in a way that Activate just hasn't.
I also think that it's to do with, who the Activate are looking to target as well. Activate have talked about welcoming all Conservatives, whether they're One Nation, New Right, Traditional or Liberal, and Momentum clearly didn't. It didn't want anything to do with the Fabian Society. It didn't want anything to do with people like Chuka Umunna. It wanted people in the Labour Party who supported Jeremy Corbyn and who were left-wing. If you can think about the type of person that represents all of One Nation, New Right, Traditional, Liberal conservatism, it doesn't exist. That person, or if it does exist, you wouldn't want to meet him in a dinner party setting or anything. They'd just be wet and washy and boring. And I think...
Well, they'd be David Cameron, wouldn't they?
For a little bit.
And for a while, David Cameron tried to have an online presence in this way, didn't he? What was it called?
Web Cameron.
The Web Cameron, there we go. Which never got traction. But then you see, people said then that was because... social media somehow inherently, and therefore younger people, are inherently left-wing and right-wing politics doesn't work online. We know that's not true because of Trump.
Yeah, but I think it's also to do with the substance of policies. The thing about Trump and the right wing was that they came up with policies that people could chant back, build a wall, lock her up. But I think that the Tories at the moment can't answer decent questions like, how do I get an education? How do I get a house?
Well, hold on.
How do I get a job?
Their argument to young people is... we know that student fees is an issue for you, but it's not realistic to say at this stage, 20 years after they were introduced, let's abolish them. Unfortunately, that isn't a catchy slogan, but that is their policy. Yeah, but it's fine.
There was a millennial manifesto issued by the Adam Smith Institute, which is sort of centre-right think tank, a few days ago. And it was a really strange document because the report they produced actually had quite a lot of substantive, decent, thoughtful policies in it about tuition fees and social care and housing and the economy and jobs. But then they chose to present it in this really patronising way, which felt a bit like the whole Activate process, where they pulled out two lines from it about, they'd called air passenger duty the Ibiza tax and said they were going to eliminate it for people under 30 so that you could go clubbing more cheaply. And then talked about decriminalising drugs, which may or may not be a good idea, but to pick that out just seems slightly...
It's really worth going to find the document because it is written by someone who, or it seems to, and it reads like someone who's basically just seen young people in a test tube and gone, this is what young people like. I know, we've got all of these. And yet, at least it had policies, though. That's the thing, is at least there was some kind of idea of policy ideas. It's just written incredibly strangely.
It did feel like the authors felt that young people were an entirely separate species who had completely different hopes and aims and desire. And it didn't feel like it was written for a part of the population that could be sympathetic to the Conservative Party already. It felt like they were speaking a foreign language.
So the Conservatives might always suffer from that simply because they are run by an establishment elite. There isn't a union supporting them. It is a top-down organisation funded by millionaires. They can't help that. So what should they do to have an online presence? It's all very well slagging it off. Felicity, what would you advise the Conservatives to do to get young people engaged, if not this?
I think they need to do some more research. I think they need to have more inspiring policies.
I think there's an element of Toryism that I think will never really appeal to young people, and I think that then they have to really understand that and look at other types of centre-right ideology that have worked among young people. Like, for instance, in the US, libertarianism is a big thing, and there's lots and lots of young people coming out in favour of Rand Paul and Gary Johnson and people like that. And I think that they have to be aware as a party that they can't have this blanket, this big overall statement that it doesn't appeal to young people at the moment.
That was the same for young lefties as well. Until very recently, the idea of supporting Jeremy Corbyn in a rally would have seemed laughable.
I think it's to do with the image that is portrayed by, I think, passionate and caring conservatism. It just doesn't exist anymore. And it isn't out there. And I think the thing is that if you are a young person and you want to show that you care, it's very easy to pin yourself onto campaigns. People's identity is based around the things that they choose to go and support. And that happens a lot when you're younger and perhaps does less so when you get older.
It's interesting that you mentioned Jacob Rees-Mogg because his Instagram account and his path on social media is actually doing incredibly well. And I think the idea that and some of it is actually really very funny, the idea that he can do this very self-deprecating, dry, sarcastic sarcastic look at himself, I think is quite popular. And I wonder whether there is something in that they sort of have to almost...
I mean, I think people want to be ruled by posh people at some point. There are lots of people in this country that I think do like that whole shtick.
And Boris Johnson had a relatively young following as well. He did seem able to reach out to people, but he was a bigger character, and I wonder if that's also part of the reason the Conservatives have suffered, is they don't have big characters, certainly not on the front bench at the moment.
Next up, it's your turn, Felicity. What have you brought with you today?
It's what people aren't saying about Hurricane Harvey.
Now, you might ask, why would anybody stay and ride out this storm? What people around here say are two things, really. First of all, they didn't expect it to be as intense, as ferocious as it was in the end. It did blow up very, very fast and pick up a lot of power very quickly in the Gulf of Mexico. And the second thing is that people say here, they just don't have very much money. They don't have the resources. A woman was saying to us that she just didn't have enough money to get out. She couldn't afford it. She had nowhere else to go. And that feeds into what will happen now and the problems for this area, because the question is, how are people going to rebuild their lives?
The BBC's James Cook in Rockport, Texas. Now, Felicity, I would argue Hurricane Harvey is not exactly an under-the-radar news story this week. Why are you so blatantly flouting my rules?
You've heard about the hurricane? No, I'm not trying to pretend that this isn't the biggest news story one of the biggest news stories since Friday. But I do think it's interesting in what isn't being talked about. I think there's been a few articles doing the rounds which is saying there are so many aspects of this disaster that are completely flying under the radar and no one wants to mention.
Great, let's do it.
So firstly, climate change, I think, is one of the big ones, really. And I think you could go as far as to say that some of the news reports have actually almost bordering on being poor examples of journalism because they're not bringing up climate change and they're not talking about... I think we like the idea that this is a natural disaster. This is Mother Nature unleashing her fury, this very romantic idea of nature, and failing to recognise that actually it has been exacerbated by man-made climate change. The oceans are warmer, it's bigger storms, it's more rainfall.
Well, we don't know. We can speculate with some scientific accuracy, but we don't know, do we, until there's a proper scientific investigation of the data that it was caused by climate change. So that would be speculative to say that.
I don't think you can...
The news is there's been a storm.
It's not a direct cause, but I think it's impossible to say that climate change hasn't made it a far more catastrophic disaster than it could have otherwise
Would
been.
you like to see more of that in the news, Jamie?
Yeah, certainly. And I also think that saying that we don't know scientifically, but, there's not an exact proof, I think just leads us to the apocalypse happening even sooner. I think that at some point someone needs to...
Science is analysis of data that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
Of course. So it's true to say that we don't know.
I think this is one of the problems with reporting climate change is that, the deniers are happy to play dirty. They will cherry pick data, they'll compare apples and oranges, but scientists do have to stick to the evidence and they are very reluctant to generalise from specific instances and make sweeping claims. And I'm not sure we can say that this was caused by climate change. What we can say is that a warming of the oceans will make this sort of event more likely, and a rising of sea levels would certainly make the effects of it worse. I can understand the reluctance of journalists to talk about climate change as a cause because they know that, A, they could end up damaging the case that scientists are trying to make because it then provides the deniers with...
An example of where it may have been hysterical and overblown.
It's a really, really difficult question.
But Jamie, you were about to be hysterical and overblown. I interrupted you. Go on.
I think specifically to look at, it's widely acknowledged that increase in air temperature can cause atmosphere to take on more water, and the continued rainfall that the area is experiencing, over the past week has been, and scientists have come out and said, this is to do with the rise in sea temperatures, but also the rise in the climate and the atmosphere. And yes, I agree that that's probably about as far as they are willing to go. But we do also need to have, like you said, some people playing the man, not the ball. Then even if they're not scientists, just people out there who are fighting a cause that's saying, look, these are the links. We can't keep burying our heads in the sand about this.
But is it also not the case that in the US that journalism, when it comes to climate change, they just don't want to talk about it? And part of the reason is that if you look at Texas, this is an oil-producing state. Several oil refineries have had to close this week because of the flooding. This is very much a state and a people who rely on guzzling oil, their lifestyles, are dependent on oil. And I think for journalists, particularly in America, to start saying, well, this is climate change, they would have to change every single aspect of the way they live their lives, and that's just not going to happen.
Do you know what I think?
So I think there's something more insidious going on with the way it's being reported, or the way we're emitting.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think what might make it change. So at the moment, if you try and sue for damage based on an act of God or this kind of act of nature, you'll generally lose because it's seen to be you're not responsible for. But there is a feeling that what might happen is this idea of attribution science, which would allow courts to decide with reasonable confidence that individual events have been exacerbated by man-made climate change. So once courts are able to say, look, you guys haven't been signing up to Paris, for instance, and this has caused climate change to exacerbate the problem, and people start losing money over it, we could be looking in a situation where people are willing to talk about climate change being a cause more readily.
But then if we got to that stage, it would get a bit ridiculous, wouldn't it? Let's say America did stay with the Paris Climate Change Accord, but China hadn't. Is a court in Alabama going to say, well, let's sue China because they're pumping out toxic fumes into the
I think that there's a possibility that you could end up having governments and firms, like, companies that are contributing to the climate being successfully sued, certainly.
Also there's a sensitivity, isn't there, Felicity? When you say it's insidious that reporters aren't mentioning it, it's also people in Texas are losing their homes. Perhaps now isn't the time to tell them their lifestyles are wrong. Wait a month.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think the idea of almost victim blaming and saying, well, it's partly your fault, is when the tragedy is unfolding. That's not helpful, and the whole idea of politicising natural disaster is very problematic, even though I think both sides do. But I think Trump is obviously looking at Katrina and Bush's response to that and trying to learn some lessons. But I do think that's going on. But I think it's also another thing that isn't maybe being acknowledged as much as it should be, is that this is a social disaster, and disasters don't hit everyone fairly. And I think people like the idea that they do, rich or poor, everyone's affected, and then we all come together in this major rescue operation. That's not true, particularly in this part of the world. I mean, it is undeniable that, like with Katrina, Harvey is going to affect the poorest people, is going to affect black people far worse than it is with white people. And again, that's something else that isn't in the news perhaps as much as it should be.
I mean, what we've been seeing on the news is people of all different classes and races helping each other. Are you saying that that's being shown because it makes people feel good, but it's not true?
I think people do like to take away this sense of we all came together and it didn't matter how rich or poor you were or what colour you were, we all pitched in and this terrible natural disaster came and there was nothing we could do about it and we couldn't possibly predict it. And there's almost kind of like a positive ring to it. And I think that's what I don't like about it. And I think that's when we're failing to admit really key details of this disaster, which isn't helpful for how we approach massive mega disasters in the future.
It will be interesting to see how that sort of narrative develops once the floodwaters subside and we see what the death toll is and what the damage is. Because with Katrina, I think it started in the same vein of trying to present it as how the emergency services were coming together. George W. Bush talked about the strength of response from emergency planners, but that started to unravel very, very quickly and clearly did his administration a great deal of damage. As you said, Felicity, Trump's trying to get out in front of that. I think that sense of unity, which may in parts be true and in parts be false, it's harder to sustain once people are back in their kind of flood-damaged homes or once the funerals start, it becomes harder to sustain that.
OK, Holden, it's your turn to give us a happy finish.
Well, I'm afraid we're about to discover that comedy may be no laughing matter.
So a great and original television art form is dying. It really is. While there's nothing we can do about shrinking budgets, fractured audiences, and TV companies turning their fabulous studio facilities into prime real estate, empty flats to be rented out as investment blocks, it might help if commentator, critic, and columnist alike stop treating studio sitcom with such thoughtless contempt. As if the only comic art of any real value is the comedy that pretends it isn't trying to be funny.
Ben Elton there, blaming social media for the demise of the great British sitcom. Before we analyse what he said, Holden, just recap what he was doing and where he said this, because it hasn't been that well reported.
No, this was the first Ronnie Barker Memorial Lecture, and it's available on the BBC iPlayer if you would choose to listen to the whole speech. And it's really Ben Elton setting out his, either his manifesto for comedy or his excuses for why it hasn't really been the success it once was.
Yeah, for anyone listening who hasn't followed the career of Ben Elton recently, he's still the writer of some best-selling novels and popular musicals, isn't he? But in comedy terms, actually, he hasn't really had a hit for about 20 years.
No, he's been working to bring down the sitcom from within, and now he says social media's finished off the job.
Yeah, but, in his repertoire is Blackadder and Mr. Bean and The Thin Blue Line, so he has written some classic sitcoms. Is he partially right that these days people are too critical too quickly, and it is an art form that's dying because people judge it too quickly and don't let it breathe?
I think he's onto something, and clearly sitcoms don't bring together the country in a way that they once did. I'm not sure that he's right to blame social media. I think there's always been a slightly sniffy response to a lot of sitcoms, and some of them have eventually won over critical acclaim. Others have always been regarded with suspicion by critics, but then loved by audiences.
I mean, Mrs. Brown's Boys is the obvious one at the moment, right? I've never read a good review of it, but the public love it.
And he mentions Mrs. Brown's Boys a few times and holds up the fact that it gets 11 million viewers on BBC One when 3 or 4 million would generally be regarded as a success, which slightly undermines his argument that sitcoms are dying. The fact that he then goes on to talk about the critical response suggests to me that what he's actually worried about is the death of respect for sitcoms, or possibly for sitcom writers like him.
I suppose it depends how you define a sitcom, doesn't it, Jamie? Because there is a massive audience amongst millennials for comedy. It's just that usually now it's sort of single camera stuff. It's a little bit more ironised and a bit more subtle than your studio-based, laugh-out-loud theatrical sitcom.
He really pins the Office as being the kind of changing of the guard from that kind of big, almost like theatrical things like Dad's Army and Fawlty Towers, which has a live audience soundtrack kind of laughing along with it. And he pins that on The Office as being like the change when suddenly the kind of taste moved on and people stopped finding some certain aspects of that kind of theatrical. I actually went to see a recording of Upstart Crow, which is his most recent one, and there's been lots of examples of really quite interesting and intricate and funny sitcoms. You look at Master of None on Netflix, and Fleabag was hugely critically acclaimed, and those are sitcoms, but they're just not in the same style that perhaps Ben Elton can write.
Because Fleabag was actually quite dark, and it brought in a lot of darkness to a genre that maybe hadn't been experienced before. Or The Trip has some dark aspects to it.
I mean, there are lots of things. There's the Sharon Horgan one as well, which everyone always mentions. Catastrophe, right? I mean, those are great shows, but let's be honest, when you say, they're quite dark and interesting, that sort of means that's what the middle classes are watching. Where are the big sort of BBC One sitcoms of the Only Fools and Horses, Miranda type? There are fewer of those, and the public do like them when they arrive.
Part of the reason is just that there are so many other options available. So Only Fools and Horses would get up to, nearly 20 million people for a Christmas special. But how many of those people would have been watching something else if there were more than 3 channels at the time? So it's just, people who would have preferred to watch something else now have those things to watch.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think programs like Made in Chelsea or Tower, reality TV has taken off in a massive way. Maybe that's crowding out the audience, but also documentaries have more currency than they ever did. I think
the structured reality shows like Tower and Made in Chelsea, they take on sitcom tropes all the time. Like, they have characters. It's like, Made in Chelsea, which I have watched for my sins in the past. What is Spencer Matthews up to this week? God, he's cheated on his girlfriend again. And these are all the ideas of sitcoms that they've just been moved into this much cheaper way of running a show. So I don't think it's dead. I just think things have moved on.
I also think the sort of specific tastes at the moment may make it harder to make those sorts of studio sitcoms with a live audience, just because the pace has picked up so much. And if you go back and look at Only Fools and Horses, it feels glacially slow now. And in Fawlty Towers, which is quite densely written, you would have scenes which lasted 5, sometimes even 10 minutes, all set around the hotel reception. And that's easier to do on a single set in front of an audience. Now, a lot of the popular comedies, particularly American ones, tend to have scenes that last 30 seconds and then you're cutting immediately. So it's much more about editing rather than those sorts of long scenes with the same characters all focused on a central point.
The thing about Mrs. Brown Boys and Miranda, I guess, was that they were quite self-referential about the fact that they are using an audience. You know, you see the camera shows the audience, it cuts away, there's breaking the fourth wall and everything, and you know, you can't imagine, you know, that going on in things like Fawlty Towers Are Only Fools and Horses, but that's just because now, yeah, things have moved on.
But might they move back? I mean, is there a possibility, do you think, still of having another Mrs. Brown's Boys? Because we're talking about Mrs. Brown's Boys like it's a contemporary thing, but actually it started, 7-8 years ago and was based on a theatre show that began 10 years before that. Is there any chance that a sort of hip, young, cool comedian might come along and do a studio sitcom?
Part of the problem is that we're very used to sort of looking back with rose-tinted spectacles and just saying everything was better back then. We had Fawlty Towers, we had Dad's Army, and everything today is rubbish. That's just what we tend to do. But actually, I don't think there's any real pattern that suggests that's the case.
There are also the sort of rises and falls in fashion. So sketch shows, you kind of tend to get 5 years where there's loads of sketch shows and then 5 years where there aren't. I was trying to think if there are of any sort of current sitcoms that fit the bill that Ben Elton sort of set out. And the only one I could really come up with was The Big Bang Theory, in the States, which does have that kind of cool, young, millennial feel to it, but is very definitely studio-based, has that kind of classic...
I think you could find a cool, young, hip comedian to start a sitcom about Brexit and then get them to lead to Activate. Isn't that the idea?
Is that you trying to wrap up the show? Because you didn't mention Hurricane Harvey.
That's not part of the show, though, is it? That's the thing. That was the problem with the Hurricane Harvey
I'm very
topic.
thankful that this show is not recorded in front of a live studio audience. But that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity, Capon, Jamie Timson and Holden Frith. For more from The Week, do visit theweek.co.uk, download The Weekday, our free iPhone app, or you can subscribe, of course, to the magazine. And don't forget to subscribe to this. If you're listening to this right now through a computer and you're not quite sure how you got here, you can hear brand new episodes of this show, The Week Unwrapped, as soon as they're available. All you need to do is find us on iTunes or Pocket Casts or Stitcher, basically wherever you find podcasts. There we are. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sam Bonham at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.